The dust rose in lazy swirls as the wind swept across the barren ranch yard, carrying with it the dry scent of sun-baked earth and wood long forgotten by fresh paint. The once proud ranch house stood crooked in its foundation, windows cracked, shingles curled back like paper left in the rain. Years ago, this place had been a dream, whispered about between two people who thought they'd build a life together out here, raise cattle, and carve their story into the land. But dreams had a way of breaking when pride grew larger than love. He had left with laughter dripping from his voice, mocking the woman who chose to stay with what he called a pile of ruins. To him, the ranch was nothing more than a reminder of failure, a scar in the dirt. To her, it was something else entirely, a chance to prove everyone wrong. She had sat on the porch that night after he rode away, her hands trembling not from weakness, but from anger that burned like wildfire. The neighbors whispered that she'd sell, that no woman alone could manage such a spread, not with debts pressing in and fences falling apart. They expected her to give up. She didn't. The land was stubborn, but so was she. She had no wealth to lean on, no brothers or father to guard her path. What she had was grit, and it settled into her bones like iron. Each day after that, she rose before dawn, patched fences until her fingers bled, bargained with ranch hands who doubted her, and rode further into the hills to find water when the wells turned dry. The ranch didn't yield easily. The land tested her, tore at her spirit, demanded sweat in place of comfort. And yet, little by little, something began to change. The barn was mended, a new roof gleamed in the sun, the fields turned greener after she struck a deal to bring in irrigation. Cattle returned to the pastures, strong and restless. Men who had once laughed at her stubbornness began asking for work, for she had gained not only strength but respect. By the time the town realized it, she wasn't the broken woman abandoned on a dying ranch. She was the one building an empire in the dust. Still, the memory of his mocking words lingered. She remembered the smirk on his face, the way he had looked back over his shoulder as though the ranch and the woman who guarded it were both beneath him. She told herself it no longer mattered. Yet some nights, when the firelight flickered low, she found herself whispering promises to the silence that one day he would see. One day, the man who thought she was nothing would return to find her stronger, richer, and wilder than anything he could imagine. The town had grown used to the sight of her riding through on horseback. Shoulders squared, eyes steady beneath the brim of her hat, they spoke her name with a mix of awe and disbelief. Because women were supposed to tend homes, not run ranches that spanned for miles. But she had carved out a place no man could take from her. She dealt with traders in the stockyards, outbid rivals at auctions, and stood her ground when the old ranchers tried to push her aside. And though her success spread like rumor through every saloon and store, she kept her heart guarded, never letting anyone see the hurt that had once driven her. Seasons passed, winters biting and summers scorching, until the ranch was no longer the broken dream he had scorned, but a place of life and power. New barns stood proud, the herd multiplied, and the land stretched out rich beneath the wide skies. She had turned ashes into something golden. But stories like this never stay quiet. Word travels fast, across dusty trails and trading posts. And word eventually reached him. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps pride, or perhaps something darker. But one day, years after he had laughed his way out of her life, he returned. The town felt the shift before she did. Whispers swept through the general store, the blacksmith's yard, the saloon. He was back. The man who had mocked her, who had left her to fend for herself, was riding into town with the swagger of someone who believed the world still bent to his will. When she first heard the news, she said nothing. Her hand stayed steady on the reins as she led her horse along the fence line. But her mind tightened like a drawn bow. What did he expect to find here? The same broken boards and empty fields he had abandoned? The same woman he had mocked and left behind? The sky darkened that evening as she rode back toward the house. Lantern lights spilled from the windows, warm against the growing dusk. She dismounted and stood still for a long moment, her hat shadowing her eyes. In the distance, the faint echo of hooves reached her ears. He was closer than she thought. The man who had once laughed at her broken ranch was returning. And what he would find waiting for him was not the fragile memory he left behind, but a woman forged in dust and fire, with wealth in her land, steel in her voice, and a wildness no one could tame. But would he recognize the woman she had become? Or would the weight of his own pride blind him to what stood before him? The sound of hooves grew louder. She straightened, her breath slow and steady, the night air sharp with tension. Somewhere inside the old wound burned, but over it lay something new power, and the unshakable knowledge that this time the story would not belong to him. And just as the first stars broke through the sky, the silhouette of a rider appeared on the horizon. Moving closer with every heartbeat, the rider on the horizon drew nearer with every beat of the horse's hooves, the fading light casting long shadows across the land she had poured her life into. The sound was steady, unhurried, almost taunting in its rhythm. She stood rooted to the ground, her gloved hands tightening around the reins of her own horse as though steadying herself for what was to come. Time had stretched and bent since he'd left, yet in that moment it seemed to collapse, pulling every memory back into sharp focus, the laughter that had stung like a blade, the smirk that told her he didn't believe in her, and the silence that followed his departure. The air was heavy, the kind that comes before a storm, and her mind churned as she thought of all that had happened since the day he rode away. Back then, the ranch had been crumbling under debt and drought, and she had been left to pick up the pieces with little more than sheer will. She had worked harder than any soul around, driving herself past exhaustion, because there had been no choice. In the beginning, the nights had been the hardest. When she lay awake listening to the creak of the wind against the roof and the howl of coyotes beyond the fields, wondering if she had been a fool for staying. But dawn always came, and with it another chance to prove herself. She learned to mend fences faster than the men she hired, learned which traders could be trusted and which ones tried to cheat her. She learned how to stretch a dollar further than most thought possible, how to bargain with cattle buyers until they shook their heads in disbelief at her stubbornness. Slowly, almost painfully, the ranch began to shift from brokenness to strength. The land had become her teacher, and she, its most determined student. Every ridge, every creek, every patch of stubborn grass became known to her as though it were etched into her soul. She learned when to push the herd to higher ground and when to let them rest, when to cut losses and when to gamble everything on a new deal. With each passing season, she grew tougher, her voice carrying a firmness that made even seasoned ranch hands pause before questioning her, yet the memory of him never faded. His words had been the scar she carried, the wound that never fully healed. He hadn't just mocked the ranch, he had mocked her resolve, her belief that something broken could be made whole again. And though she had built wealth, respect, and power, there were nights when his ghost slipped back into her thoughts. Not because she still wanted him, but because she wanted him to see, to know he had been wrong, to choke on the truth of it. Now, as the rider approached, her chest tightened with an old ache she thought she had buried beneath the dirt and sweat of the years. He had returned, and though she had told herself countless times that it wouldn't matter if he ever did, she couldn't ignore the questions that rushed to her mind. Why now? What did he want? Did he expect to find her waiting, broken, still clinging to the dream he abandoned? Or had the whispers of her success pulled him back, hungry to see what had become of the woman he once dismissed? The horse crested the ridge, and the rider came into full view. His hat was pulled low, his shoulders broad against the twilight, his posture still carrying that same careless confidence she remembered too well. Time had touched him, but not softened him. If anything, he looked more certain of himself, as though the years had done nothing but feed the pride that once poisoned their life together. She turned toward the ranch house, its warm light flickering against the gloom. Everything she had built stood behind her, silent witnesses to the years of toil and the victories carved from hardship. She straightened her shoulders, reminding herself that she was not the woman he left. The ranch was no longer fragile, and neither was she. Still, the air between them felt heavy with history as he drew closer, the sound of his horse slowing with each step. The town had been buzzing for days, she knew. Word of his return had spread like wildfire, and no doubt many wondered how she would face him. They whispered behind her back at the general store. pretended not to stare at her when she rode past. Some likely hoped for a spectacle, clash between the woman who defied every expectation and the man who had once cast her aside. She intended to give them nothing more than her silence, for silence could wound sharper than any word. Yet silence would not erase the truth. Beneath the calm surface, her heart pounded with a storm of memories. She remembered the nights he had laughed at her plans, the way he had mocked her for dreaming too big, and how he had called the ranch cursed when the drought stripped the land bare. He had left her then, believing she would fail without him. And maybe she might have. Had it not been for the fire in her veins that refused to let go, the horse stopped a few paces away, his breath clouding the evening air. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them was filled with all the words left unsaid, all the bitterness, all the pride. He lifted his head, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat, scanning the land as though taking measure of what had changed. His gaze lingered on the barns, the cattle, the repaired fences, the house that now stood strong and unyielding. Her jaw tightened. She wanted him to see, but not for his approval. She wanted him to feel the weight of his mistake, to understand what she had done not in spite of him, but because of him. His mockery had been the spark that lit the fire. The fire had turned her into someone he would never fully grasp. The silence stretched, thick and sharp, until the night seemed to hold its breath. Then, faintly, the wind carried the sound of voices from the far fields, her men finishing their work, calling out to each other as they closed the gates and drove the cattle into the corral. Life pulsed all around them, a life she had built with her own hands. And it stood in stark contrast to the emptiness he had left her with years ago. Still, she said nothing. The moment demanded patience. Let him speak first. Let him stumble under the weight of the truth staring him in the face. She had no need to prove anything. The land, the wealth, the power, all spoke louder than words ever could. Yet inside her, a storm brewed. The return of the man who had once shattered her spirit was not just a test of strength. It was a reminder that the past never truly stayed buried. His presence carried questions she wasn't ready to answer, dangers she couldn't yet name. And though she stood firm in the dirt of her hard-won empire, she knew this was only the beginning. The rider shifted in his saddle, his eyes meeting hers across the fading light. Something flickered their curiosity, perhaps, or regret, or maybe just the same arrogance she remembered. Whatever it was enough to send a shiver through the night. Enough to remind her that the battle she thought she had already won was only now beginning. The sky above deepened to black, the stars glittering like sharp fragments of glass, and in the silence between them, the air grew thick with everything unspoken. He had returned to the ranch he once mocked, and she stood ready to face him not as the woman he had abandoned, but as someone far richer, stronger, and wilder than he could ever have imagined. But as the night deepened and the world seemed to narrow to the space between them, a single thought pressed hard against her chest. What had brought him back now after all these years? And more importantly, what storm was he carrying with him that could threaten everything she had fought so hard to build? The first words he chose were plain, the kind men use when they have come too far to turn back. He tipped his hat and asked if there was a place a traveler might rest his horse. She held his gaze for a long breath, just long enough to make clear that traveler was not the right word. Then she nodded, toward the pump by the corral. He dismounted without a smile and led the animal over, every step slow, measured. The way a man moves when he knows the ground. Remember him. She kept her voice steady as she called, to the bunkhouse for one of the hands to bring oats and water. A young rider hurried up, hat in his hands, eyes darting between them. He had joined the crew last winter, a quiet sort who worked hard and asked little. She sent him to the tack room for an extra blanket. The evening air had turned sharp. Behind them, the herd mumbled in the dark. 100 soft sounds that meant safety and money. In months of labor she would not see wasted. He thanked her with that same guarded tone and turned his attention to the ranch yard. She saw the way he studied every post and rail, counting improvements, marking where the house had been straightened and the porch rebuilt. He was reading the land the way he always had, learning its story without asking for a single sentence. Only this time, the story did not belong to him. The wind cut across the yard, rattling a tin sign from the blacksmith shop and carrying hints of wood smoke from the kitchen. She told him supper was being served for the crew and he could take a plate if he wished. He nodded once but did not move. They stood like that, both listening to a night that knew their history too well. He broke the silence first. He said he had business in town. She thought of the bank, the stockyard, the lawyer who kept a ledger under his desk that recorded more than it should. She asked, "What kind of business?" He said it touched on water rights, grazing lines, some new maps the county surveyor was drawing for the railroad spur that would cut near the valley. The word railroad pressed against her ribs like a fist. Tracks meant buyers, good prices, and fast routes to market. They also meant claim jumpers, land speculation, and strangers who believed money could be pulled from dirt like weeds. He watched her carefully as he spoke, as if weighing how much she already knew. She did not blink. Water and grass were the gold of this country. A spur line could make or break any spread between here and the mesa. If a man wanted to gain a hold over a rancher, he could do it with a map, a paper stamp, and some quiet pressure on a county clerk. She had learned that quickly when the first rumors blew in last fall. The door to the kitchen opened, and one of her senior hands stepped out, wiping his palms on a towel. He was broad-shouldered, salt and pepper hair at his temples, and a calm voice that kept hot tempers from boiling over. He asked if everything was all right. She said it was, then asked him to walk the south fence in the morning and check the new posts by the creek. If the surveyor came by, she wanted eyes on him. The hand looked from her to the man by the pump and back again. He gave a short nod and slipped away. Her visitor lifted his canteen and drank. The years showed in the lines around his eyes, the dust etched into his coat, the way his hand lingered on the horse's neck longer than it used to. He finally asked if she was willing to hear what had brought him. She told him to speak. He said a speculator outfit out of the capital had started buying distressed land to the north. They were targeting ranches that had loans due, pressing folks who could not read the fine print, then gobbling up water draws that fed half the valley. He paused, choosing careful words. He said he had a connection to one of the buyers. He said the outfit would soon make a move farther south. He said her land was on their maps. She felt the old heat flare in her chest. When he left years ago, he had mocked the broken boards and empty wells. Now he had come back speaking of maps and buyers in danger that crept along the edges of deeds. She wanted to laugh at the strange turn of it, but the laughter would have tasted like ash. Instead, she asked why he cared whether her land was on anyone's map. He did not answer right away. Finally, he said some men owe debts they can never pay, and others try to square them anyway. It was not an apology. It did not need to be. She led him to the cookhouse. The crew looked up from their plates without surprise. Word travels fast in a yard. She watched him take a seat at the far end of the long table, shoulders stiff as though he expected a blow. No one spoke to him for the first few minutes. Then the young writer asked where he had come from. He said the high plain. Someone else asked what the weather was like. He said cold and dry. A few of the men nodded. Ranch talk. Just enough to keep the air from cracking. After supper. She brought him to the porch, and they sat opposite each other, the distance measured and safe. He told her the outfit's boss was a banker who liked to hide behind hired hands. Their method was simple. Slip notes to the right borrowers, shadow the county meetings, lean on a sheriff when needed, and keep a surveyor friendly. If a rancher fought back, they found a way to press. He said they had already won 2 fights up north and were looking for easier targets now. She asked if he was part of the outfit. He said he had worked for a trader who sold cattle to them. He learned more than he wanted and left when the numbers stopped smelling right. He said the boss would not forget that. The admission hung in the air. A man who walked away from a boss like that did not do it for nothing. The next morning, the ranch woke early, and she threw herself into work with more force than usual. The crew drove the herd to the eastern pasture to fatten for the spring stockyard. She rode the creek line where cottonwoods curled like old hands and watched the water run shallow but steady. A small dam she had built last year gave the lower fields a drink when the clouds failed. It was the heart of the ranch now, Anyone holding the water held the land. She found tracks near the north bend that were not hers. The prints were narrow, the kind the surveyor's pony left, and they were fresh. She had not given permission for a survey. She followed the marks to a spot where the bank rose, and there she saw a small stake set in the ground with a strip of red cloth. It fluttered with a smug sort of confidence. She cut it free and put it in her pocket. On her way back, she met the senior hand on a rise. He said a rider had been seen talking to a clerk outside the courthouse 2 days ago, asking about deed copies. The clerk had looked nervous and had pocketed something quickly. The hand did not like the smell of it. She told him to choose 2 men he trusted and ride to town under simple business. Keep eyes open. Be friendly. Spend a coin or 2. Learn something. He agreed and asked if she wanted a shadow on the man who had returned. She said no. Not yet. In the days that followed, tension stretched tight as wire. The returned man kept his distance but did not leave. He helped in the yard without being asked, fixed a hinge on the barn door, replaced a broken latch on the gate. He never stepped into the house uninvited. He ate with the crew. He said little. The men began to treat him like any other hand passing through. She kept watching, weighing. There were moments she remembered his easy laugh from another life, but the memory slid off her like water off oiled leather. Whatever they had once tried to be had burned away. The land was what mattered. When her 2 riders came back from town, they brought tidings that set the crew on edge. The bank had a new ledger. Names were being listed, numbers penciled beside them, and most of the names belonged to ranchers near the creek that fed into her land. The clerk had been seen meeting after dark with a stranger who matched the shape of the banker's deputy. The surveyor had rented a small room and worked late by lamplight. And at the far end of the saloon, a man with city boots had been asking careless questions about how much beef moved through the valley in a good season. She called a quiet meeting in the barn. The senior hand, the young rider, and 3 others she trusted gathered in the dim light that smelled of hay and leather. They spoke softly. She laid out what she knew. Red stakes. Fresh tracks. The railroad spur pushing closer. A bank ledger with hungry teeth. She said the outfit would try to prove old boundaries wrong, claim a sliver of water, and choke the ranch from the edges. The men listened, faces set, eyes hard. One suggested hiring a lawyer from the capital. Another said lawyers cost more than a wagon of winter grain and came late. The young rider asked what they could do now. She said they would bring their own survey, mark the lines true, guard the creek, and keep records tight. They would also visit every neighbor within a day's ride and share what they had learned. Strong fences make good friends. Shared danger makes stronger ones. That afternoon, she rode to the North Ridge with the returned man trailing at a distance. He had asked if she wanted company on the line. She had not said yes, but she had not said no. The ridge gave a view of the whole valley, a patchwork of grass, dry sage, and long shadows stretching to the blue rim of the hills. He pointed toward a thin track of trees that bent with the water. He said the outfit would come for that first. It was the easiest to dispute because the creek had shifted after last year's flood. He said they would claim the new bend cut along an old survey and eat into her share. She turned in her saddle and asked why he knew the creek had moved. He said he had always paid attention to water. She did not let him see the small nod she gave. The man had his faults, but he could read land like a book that refused to lie. They reached the bend as a hawk lifted from the brush and rode the wind. There were more red stakes tucked behind rocks, this time with numbers scratched on tiny pieces of tin. She picked them up, one by one, and slid them into her saddlebag. Then she saw something else. A set of hoofprints with a chipped shoe on the left hind. The same mark had been visible in town last year when the surveyor came through. She remembered because she remembered everything that threatened the ranch, the returned man. Dismounted to study the muddy edge. He told her the rider had camped nearby. Ashes were still warm, coals buried to hide smoke. Whoever it was had been close, working during the quiet hours before dawn. He circled once, then squinted toward the hills. He said they were not alone. She followed his gaze and spotted a glint in the scrub. A scope or a spyglass, it was hard to tell. When the figure realized it had been seen, it slipped away, low and fast. They gave chase for a short distance and then stopped. Chasing a shadow into broken country was a fool's errand. She felt heat rise again, a steady burn that kept her breath tight. She turned her horse back toward the ranch, riding harder than before. Each hoofbeat, like a vow to stand unshaken. By the time they reached the yard, clouds were rolling in from the west, dark as iron. The crew moved with quick purpose, battening down gear and driving the herd closer to shelter. Storms could kill calves and ruin early grass. She stood on the porch and watched lightning thread the sky. The returned man joined her, but kept a step back. He said storms bring cover, and cover brings bold moves from men who prefer the dark. She knew he was right. That night, with rain drumming the roof and the walls humming with wind, a rider pounded into the yard with a cloak soaked through. He was a neighbor from the west slope, a man with a thin mustache and honest eyes. He said strangers had come to his place at dusk with papers claiming rights to his spring. They had a deputy with them who said he had orders to keep the peace. The neighbor had told them peace would be harder to keep if his cattle went thirsty. The strangers said they would return with a judge. She invited him inside, sat him near the stove, and pressed a hot cup into his hands. She assured him he had friends here. She said they would ride out at first light, rain or no rain, and stand by him. He looked at the returned man and asked if he could be trusted. She answered for both of them. Trust would be earned by the work ahead. The neighbor nodded. That was enough for now. When the rider left, she found herself alone in the hallway for a moment. The lantern throwing a thin line of light across the floorboards she had refinished by hand. She thought of the railroad, the bank, the surveyor, the deputy who wore law like a new coat. She thought of the man on her porch who had once mocked a broken ranch and now spoke of danger like it had followed him across the plain. She did not know if he had come to fix some wrong or to make himself useful in the winning. She only knew the storm outside matched the one inside her. Toward midnight, the young rider knocked softly. He said he had seen a light near the north hill through a break in the rain. A single lantern, then darkness. She asked how sure he was. He said sure enough to saddle a horse. She gathered her coat, her rifle, and a small pouch of papers, including copies of the old deed and the new irrigation permit. She told the returned man he could ride with them or stay behind. He chose to ride. The senior hand joined without being asked. They moved out under the storm. The world reduced to rain and the glow of lightning. The creek swelled and hissed at the banks. When they reached the hill, they dismounted and climbed the last stretch on foot. The ground was slick and cold. At the top, they crouched behind a cluster of rock and saw it. A lantern tucked low against a saddle. Two figures bent over a set of markers, pounding stakes into wet soil. One figure turned, and even from that distance, she recognized the trimmed coat of the deputy and the easy smile of a man who believed papers carried more power than people. The second figure wore the surveyor's roll-up pack. The returned man leaned close and whispered that they were setting a line while the creek ran high. In the morning, the flood would cover the fresh work and wash any prints clean. She breathed through the flash of anger and kept her voice level as she asked the senior hand how long it would take to bring 3 of their crew up here with shovels and a transport board. He said less than an hour. She told the young rider to fetch them and leave no trail a blind man could not follow. They waited while the two figures worked. Rain beat on their hats. Lightning carved the sky white again and again. The deputy glanced around now and then, but the storm kept his view short. The surveyor scratched on a tin plate, using his knee as a desk, the pencil trapped in gloved fingers. When they finished, they set the lantern low and started down the hill in the opposite direction. Using the storm to hide their retreat, she did not move until the light flickered to nothing. Then she stood and walked to the fresh stakes, rain soaking her coat, mud pulling at her boots. She read the numbers scratched on tin and understood the trick. The line would cut almost a third of the water draw if left to stand. She lifted the first stake out of the ground and handed it to the returned man. Then the second. Then the third. The senior hand opened his mouth to speak and closed it again when he saw her eyes. By the time the crew arrived with shovels and the transport board, the hill was slick with running water. They worked fast, lifting every new marker, bagging each one, and marking the true line with their own stones. Each stone tied with a strip of cloth cut from her saddlebag. She dictated a record as they worked, voice calm and exact. Date, hour, weather, the names of every man present. She spoke like a ledger she could trust. The young rider wrote it down with hands that did not shake when they were done. She told them to return by the long way, keeping to dry ground where they could. She and the returned man took the shortest path to the ranch, heads low, horses steady. Near the creek he slowed and said they would not stop now. The outfit would step harder after this. He asked if she was ready for that kind of fight. She looked at the dark water, at the land that had shaped her into something unbreakable. Said she had been ready since the day he rode away. They reached the yard before dawn. Shadows lay thick under the eaves. She slid from the saddle and felt the mud pull at her heels. As she crossed the porch, a shape moved by the gate. A match flared, bright and small, and lit the face of the deputy. He stood there, calm as a Sunday preacher, rain dripping from his hat. He held a paper in one hand and a smile in the other. He said he had business with the owner of the ranch. He said a new boundary had been recorded during the night. He said he had authority to make sure no one interfered. Her crew shifted behind her, boots scraping the boards, the returned man silent at her shoulder. She did not reach for the paper. She did not move for the door. She held the deputy's eyes and waited. In the near distance, the creek roared like a thing alive. The storm had not finished. Neither had the fight. The deputy's smile lingered as though he had already won, though the rain dripping from the brim of his hat did little to soften the edge in his eyes. He held that folded paper as if it were a weapon sharper than any blade, and the way he waved it ever so slightly carried the weight of law behind him. The storm roared around them, lightning cracking close enough to make the ground shiver, but the sound of his voice rose clear. He said the ranch boundaries had been corrected, that the survey now showed her land biting too far into county water, and that she had been in violation for months without knowing it. She did not move toward him. Her crew stood ready behind her, every man aware of what that paper could mean. She had seen tricks like this before, the kind that looked legal, but were steeped in corruption. She asked calmly who signed it. The deputy smirked, said it came straight from the courthouse, stamped and sealed, and that she could ride into town if she doubted it. He added that by then, it might be too late, since men from the North outfit would be arriving soon to inspect the ground. The returned man shifted by her side, silent but tense. She could feel the weight of his presence, not protective, but waiting. He had warned her about the outfit, warned her that the water and the spur line would bring wolves in clean boots, and now here stood one of them, bold enough to ride through a storm and bring his lies to her porch. She told the deputy he'd best leave before. Her dogs mistook him for a thief. The crew murmured in agreement, the kind of low rumble that carried more threat than shouting. But the deputy only tipped his hat and said he'd be back by sunrise with company. Then he turned and disappeared into the dark. His horse's hooves muffled by the heavy rain. When he was gone, she stepped back into the house and slammed the door hard enough that the window panes rattled. The crew lingered in the yard, talking low, eyes fixed on the road north. Inside, she paced the floor, the storm's fury echoing the fire in her chest. They were moving faster than she had expected. Red stakes were one thing, secret maps another, but now they had brought the law into it. The deputy's smugness told her everything she needed to know. This was not just a land grab. This was a plan already well in motion. The returned man followed her inside, water dripping from his coat. He said they would try to seize the water first. He said if they could claim the creek, everything else would follow. She rounded on him then, anger sparking, asking why he seemed to know their every step. For a heartbeat he did not answer, and the silence in that moment spoke louder than any words. Finally, he said he used to ride with men who thought the same way, who believed a signature and a shove could break a rancher faster than a drought. He said he had left before it swallowed him whole. But the look in her eyes told him that was not enough. Sleep did not come that night. She sat by the window watching the storm roll east, listening for hoofbeats that might return. Her mind wandered back through the years back to when he had laughed at the broken barn, when the neighbors had whispered that she'd be gone in a season, when every morning felt like standing alone against the whole world. She had fought too hard, clawed her way through too much to let a paper and a deputy undo her. At dawn, the yard was mud-thick as clay. The crew was already saddling horses, their faces drawn tight. Word had spread that riders from the outfit had been spotted on the ridge road. She told her men they would not be caught waiting. They would ride the creek and guard it with their own eyes. She gave orders sharp and clear: two to the north bend, two to the south flats, the rest to the middle where the dam gave life to the lower fields. The returned man saddled up with them, though none asked him to. She watched him carefully, half ready to order him back, but something in her gut told her to let him ride. Trust was not there, not yet. But usefulness sometimes weighed heavier than trust. They rode hard, mud splashing, the sky still heavy with clouds. At the creek, they found the sign she had feared: more stakes, more numbers scratched into tin, this time driven deep into the bank as if to withstand a flood. And worse still, they found boot prints fresh, many of them. The outfit had already been there before dawn. She bent low, running her hand over the prints. Heavy boots, too many for just a surveyor and a deputy. She counted at least 5 men. They had come bold and early, certain no one would be watching in weather like that. She rose, her jaw tight, and told the men to pull every stake, every marker, and gather them up. But before they could begin, a whistle cut through the air. It came from the ridge above. They turned as riders crested the rise. 6 men, armed, their horses restless in the mud. At their center rode the deputy, his coat dry now, his grin just as wide. He shouted down that the land was theirs by right of the new survey, and that interfering with the stakes would be breaking the law. Her men bristled, hands drifting to rifles, but she raised her arm to still them. This was not yet the fight to start in bullets. She called back that the survey was false, that the land was hers, by deed and by blood, and that no man from the capital could change it. The deputy laughed and said the judge in town saw things differently. He told her she could keep the dirt under her boots for now. But the water was no longer hers to claim. The words struck her like a hammer. She had known they would aim for the creek, but hearing it said aloud made the danger all the more real. Without water, the cattle would die, the grass would wither, and everything she had built would crumble. The deputy knew it too. That was why he smiled so wide. Her men shifted uneasily, the weight of the standoff pressing down like the heavy clouds. The returned man leaned toward her and whispered that they needed proof, something to show the town the lies being spread. He said without it, the outfit would spin the story and she would be painted the thief. She clenched her teeth, knowing he was right, hating that he was right. The deputy turned his horse, waved to his men, and they rode off slow, a taunt in their pace. She watched them disappear, fury boiling in her veins. The men looked to her for orders, their trust steady, their faces lined with worry. She told them to gather every stake, every scrap of tin, every piece of evidence, and keep it safe. She said they would ride to town soon, not to beg, but to show the truth as they worked. The young rider found something half buried in the mud, a leather pouch dropped in haste. Inside were notes, hand-scribbled maps, and a list of names: ranchers already marked, lands already taken. Her heart pounded as she read, for her name was circled in red. And next to it were words that chilled her more than the storm had: target priority. Water first. She slipped the pouch into her coat before the others could see the full weight of it. Fear was a fire she could not afford to spread. Instead, she told them they had what they needed. Proof. Evidence. Enough to fight back. But deep inside, she knew it also meant the fight was far from clean. These men did not play fair, and they would not stop until the ranch was either theirs or ashes. That night, as the crew settled uneasy in the bunkhouse and the cattle shifted restless in the pens, she sat alone in the main room with the pouch spread before her. The returned man stepped in, his face shadowed by lamplight. He asked if she trusted him now. She did not answer. Instead, she slid the pouch across the table. He scanned the papers, his jaw tightening. He said the outfit would not let this proof slip away. They would come for it, and soon. She asked why he had come back, truly. He hesitated, then said he had once thought himself better than this land, better than the woman who chose it over him. He said he had been wrong. He said men like the ones circling now would burn the valley hollow, and he could not stand by. His voice was rough, not pleading, but edged with something she could not name. She stared at him across the table, the firelight flickering between them, and knew the truth whether he meant it or not. The storm he carried was tied to hers now. The deputy had promised to return with company, and when he did, the fight would not be with words alone. The valley was bracing for a war of paper, water, and will, and the ranch sat at its heart. Outside, thunder rolled low, carrying across the open fields. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken vows. The climax was drawing near. Every breath felt like the last moment before a fuse met its flame. The deputy's threat still lingered in her ears long after he disappeared into the storm. But by morning, she was ready. The creek roared steady, swollen from the rain, and the land smelled of wet earth and iron resolve. Her crew gathered tight, eyes searching hers for direction. She told them the fight was no longer just about fences or cattle, it was about whether their labor, their families, and their future had a place in this valley. She made it clear that giving up was not an option. They rode into town with mud still on their boots, carrying the pouch of stolen papers, the red-marked stakes, and the written record from the hill. The streets were quiet, but whispers followed them as they tied their horses near the courthouse. Word of the deputy's bold claim had already spread. Some ranchers watched with folded arms, waiting to see if she would bow. Others whispered with unease, wondering if the capital men were too powerful to fight. She kept her head high, every step steady, knowing that appearances mattered just as much as truth. Inside the courthouse, the judge sat stiff behind his desk, spectacles perched low, his hand pausing mid-scratch when he saw the bundle dropped before him. The deputy stood near the corner, smug grin, gone pale at the sight of those tin-marked stakes and the notes that spelled out their crooked plans. She laid it all bare, the illegal survey under cover of night, forged lines, the collusion with outsiders who sought to bleed the valley dry. Every word was spoken clear, her voice carrying not just for herself, but for every ear pressed against the doors outside. The judge frowned, tapping the desk, reading slow. At last he looked up and said the matter would be investigated, that no change in boundaries could be recognized until a full review. It was not the final blow she wanted, but it was enough to stall the wolves. Enough to show the deputy that the ranch was not without teeth. The deputy tried to protest, his voice rising, but the crowd that had gathered made their stance clear. They had seen enough. They had heard enough. A man could bend law in shadows, but not when light poured in. Leaving the courthouse, she felt the weight ease slightly from her chest. Yet she knew the fight was not done. The outfit would not retreat so easily. Still, the balance had shifted. The town had heard the truth, and her neighbors began to step closer, their nods sharper, their greetings warmer. For years she had carried the ranch alone. But now, alliances were forming out of shared danger. In the weeks that followed, the valley stirred. Meetings were held in barns and kitchens, maps spread across wooden tables, coffee steaming as men and women planned how to stand together. Ranchers who once eyed each other with suspicion now shook hands, promising to guard creeks and share information. A watch was set along the ridges, and any stranger seen with survey tools was shadowed until he rode out. The outfit's quiet invasion had been exposed, and exposure weakened their grip. The returned man stayed. At first, the crew watched him with suspicion, but his steady work and silent loyalty began to change their minds. He patched fences without being asked, broke colts in the yard, and kept a sharp eye on the horizon. One night by the fire, he admitted to her that riding back into the valley had not been part of his plan. He had expected only ruins, perhaps proof that his mockery years ago had been right. Instead, he found her stronger, richer, and untamed in a way that humbled him. She listened, but said little. The years had carved distance between them, too deep for words to bridge in a single night. Yet she could not deny that he had stood at her side when the storm threatened, and when the deputy came with his false papers. Trust was slow, but it grew like grass after rain, inch by inch. Spring turned to summer, and with it came new challenges. The railroad surveyors finally pushed their line near the valley, their tall poles cutting across the land like stakes in a giant's game. But this time, the ranchers were ready. They met the surveyors not with fear, but with records in hand, deeds polished and true. The speculators from the capital found little room to twist when every ranch in the valley stood united. The deputy faded from sight, his power broken after his lies were dragged into daylight. Rumor said he left with the outfit men, riding south where the land was wilder and the law thinner. The judge kept the seized pouch locked in his desk, and though no official word came from the capital, the pressure eased. The valley had proven itself too strong to be carved apart by ink and deceit. For her life returned to rhythm. The creek flowed steady, the herd grew fat, and the ranch hands rode with a pride that had not been there before. They knew they belonged to something larger than a single spread. They belonged to a land defended with grit and unity. At night, when she sat on the porch watching the horizon glow with the last light, she felt the weight of it, all the years of struggle, the loneliness. The victories carved out of dust, the returned man still lingered, though he never pressed his place. Some evenings he spoke of leaving, of drifting to another town, another trail. But each morning he saddled up with the crew just the same. She never asked him to stay. She never asked him to go. The choice was his, and perhaps that freedom was the truest mark of change between them. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the hills in gold, she rode to the high ridge overlooking the valley. The air was warm, the fields below alive with cattle, barns strong, and water glinting like silver threads. The sight filled her chest with something fierce and quiet all at once. She had been mocked once, left behind with nothing but a broken ranch. Now she stood as proof that determination could outlast scorn, that a woman alone could turn ruins into riches. The returned man rode up beside her, silent for a long while. Finally, he said he had never imagined the valley could look this way. She answered that the land always had this in it, just needed someone who refused to quit. He nodded. And the silence between them felt less like distance and more like understanding. The conflict that had once threatened to tear everything away had instead brought her closer to the truth she had always known. The ranch was more than wood, water, and cattle. It was her strength, her spirit, her answer to every doubt ever thrown at her. And though danger would always circle weather and drought, market swings, or men with papers and smooth words, she was ready. As the wind carried across the ridge, she felt a calm settle in her bones. The valley was safe for now. The ranch was alive. The fight had been won not with bullets or bargains, but with courage, unity, and a will that refused to bend. She breathed deep, letting the air of victory and hard-earned peace fill her lungs. The story of the woman with the broken ranch, mocked and abandoned, had ended on her terms. She was richer now, not just in land and cattle, but in respect, strength, the knowledge that no storm, no man, and no law written in shadows could take from her what she had built. The valley carried her name now, not as a whisper of doubt, but as a testament to resilience, and as the last light slipped behind the hills, leaving the sky painted in deep blue, she smiled faintly to herself. The fight had ended, but her journey would go on. The land was hers, the future wide as the horizon, and the story forever sealed. She had risen, wilder and stronger than ever, against all odds.